There are many reasons why someone might choose to dismember a body. One possible reason could be to dispose of the body more easily. In some cases, dismemberment may be used to prevent identification of the victim. This brings us on to the case of Lisa Jo Chamberlin and Roger Lee Gillett, which took place in the state of Mississippi in 2004. Kansas authorities received a report that Lisa Jo Chamberlin and her boyfriend Roger Gillett were in possession of a stolen vehicle and were manufacturing methamphetamine at the Gillett farm in Russell County, Kansas. Based on the information received, Kansas Bureau of Investigation Officer Matthew Lyon obtained 2 search warrants. One warrant authorized the search of 606 North Ash, where Gillett and Chamberlin were staying, and the second warrant authorized the search of the Gillett farm. On March the 29th, 2004, at 3:45 p.m., officers began a search at 606 North Ash. Lyon and other KBI officers participated in the search. The search was complete at 5:05 p.m. KBI officers found Gillett and Chamberlin, as well as methamphetamine and other drug paraphernalia at 606 North Ash. KBI officers arrested Gillett and Chamberlin that day. Chamberlin was detained at the Russell County Jail. At approximately 5:13 on March the 29th, Lyon attempted to interview Chamberlin. Chamberlin was charged with a number of drug-related offenses. Meanwhile, at approximately 5:15 p.m., other officers began to search the Gillett farm. At the farm, the first officers to arrive discovered a white Dodge Dakota pickup truck and a white freezer that was taped shut with duct tape and plugged inside a wooden granary. Upon opening the freezer, the police found a dismembered body. This was the body of Vernon Hulett. They also found a black plastic trash bag which contained severed body parts. The officers returned to the Gillett farm, pulled the male body out of the freezer, and discovered another body frozen in a liquid in the bottom of the freezer. The officers thawed the contents of the freezer and extracted a second body, later identified as Linda Heintzelman. The search at the farm was completed the next day, March the 30th at 5:22 p.m. On the evening of March the 29th, Officer Lyon received a call from the Russell County Sheriff, advising him that 2 bodies had been found at the farm. Officers conducted 3 interviews with Chamberlin during the course of the day on March the 30th. At the end of Chamberlin's last interview on the afternoon of March the 30th, she agreed to show KBI officer Dalbert Howell the location where she and Gillett had dumped evidence at the landfill in Russell. At approximately 8 p.m., KBI officer Max Barrett, Howell, and Chamberlin rode to the Russell County dump, and Chamberlin indicated where some of the physical evidence from the murders had been deposited. The crime itself, Linda was not so lucky. It took her 2 days to die. She was beaten, had knife inserted inside of her, and sexually assaulted. Her throat was slit and a plastic bag pulled over her head to suffocate her. After all that, she died as a result of being suffocated with a pillow. Heintzelman was considered a person of special needs. That's what police officer Max Barrett said. Somewhat learning disabled is what Max described her as, and he said she simply couldn't remember the combination in a lockbox that Hulett had in the house. More on that later. The landfill was secured until it could be searched. The next day, on March the 31st, officers returned to the dump and recovered 7 plastic trash bags containing, among other things, one of Hullett's work shirts, pants with Hullett's name on them, a pillow heavily stained with blood, a camera, a purse containing identification which apparently belonged to Heintzelman, a wallet and identification that belonged to Hulett, a Hattiesburg, Mississippi phone book, and a cardboard center of a roll of duct tape. Barrett packaged the evidence and transferred it to the Hattiesburg police officer Rusty Keyes. During the 3 interviews on March 30th and the interview on the morning of March 31st, Chamberlin explained her relationship with Gillett and her participation in the robbery. She also went on to speak about the murders of Hulett and Heintzelman. Chamberlin met Gillett in Oregon, where she was born and raised. They lived together for a brief time in Oregon before they moved to Russell, Kansas, where they lived with some of Gillett's relatives. Around the beginning of March, Chamberlin and Gillett drove from Russell County, Kansas to Hattiesburg, Mississippi, where they stayed with Gillett's cousin Vernon Hulett and his live-in girlfriend Linda Heintzelman. On March the 6th, shortly after arriving in Hattiesburg, Gillett and Chamberlin wrecked their car. While following Hulett and Heintzelman in Heintzelman's pickup truck on Highway 49. According to Chamberlin, Heintzelman changed lanes too closely in front of their vehicle, causing them to run into the rear of Heintzelman's truck. Gillett's car was badly damaged, but Linda's truck sustained only minor damage. According to Chamberlin, Linda promised to report the accident as a claim against her insurance, and then divide the insurance proceeds with Chamberlin and Gillett. Linda never submitted this to her insurance company. Chamberlin told KBI officers that on an unknown date in March 2004, she, Gillett, Hulett, and Linda were all at Hullett's residence. Hulett and Linda suggested that Gillett and Chamberlin get their own place to live. Chamberlin agreed, but Gillett wanted to stay at Hullett's place. Chamberlin and Gillett argued about moving. Unable to drive her car in its damaged condition, Chamberlin left on foot and returned that evening to find Gillett standing on the front porch smoking a cigarette. When Chamberlin and Gillett entered the house, Gillett became violent with Linda, accusing her of not being truthful about reporting the accident to her insurance company. Gillett instructed Chamberlin to get his gun from under the mattress in the bedroom. Chamberlin complied. Chamberlin and Gillett cut the telephone wires so that Hulett and Linda could not call the police. Gillett fired 1 round inside the house to scare Hulett and Linda. Gillett punched and hit Hulett several times in an attempt to get the combination to Hullett's safe. This is the lock I mentioned earlier. Upon discovering that all the beer in the house had been consumed, Chamberlin left again to get more beer. When Chamberlin returned, Linda was bent over the safe and was not wearing any pants. Chamberlin inquired as to whether Gillett had sexually assaulted Linda. Gillett explained that he wanted to break her, so he made her take her clothes off and used a beer bottle to sexually assault her. Still unsuccessful in opening the safe, Chamberlin became impatient and told Gillett something similar to "let's just kill them and get out of here." According to Chamberlin, Gillett beat Hulett in the head with a hammer while Hulett was sitting in a chair in the living room. Gillett also slashed Hullett's throat. Chamberlin went out of the house and came back in a number of times over several hours, while Linda was lying on the floor, injured but still breathing. Eventually, Chamberlin suggested that they smother Linda. Chamberlin and Gillett worked together to bind Linda's hands behind her back so that she could not struggle with them. Gillett lifted Linda's head and Chamberlin placed a bag over it. Chamberlin told the officers that she was unable to complete the asphyxiation of Linda and went outside. She said that Linda was still breathing when she went outside, but when she returned, Linda was dead. Chamberlin told the officers that she assisted in cleaning up the murder scene. She helped move the bodies to the bathroom, where Gillett cut off Hullett's heads and arm, and she held garbage bags open while Gillett placed Hullett's arms inside the bags. Chamberlin described how she assisted in loading Linda's body and then Hullett's body, along with the black trash bag, into the freezer, and how she taped the freezer shut as Gillett stood on top of the freezer to hold it closed. Chamberlin and Gillett took Hullett's pickup truck and transported the freezer containing the 2 bodies on the back of that truck from Hulett's house to Kansas. After arriving in Kansas, they unloaded the freezer and plugged it in at the Gillett farm. She indicated that they took the items they transported from Hulett's house and disposed of them at the Russell dump. Also, she agreed to cook some meth for $500 because they needed money. Now, during the trial, Dr. Donald Podgeman, who performed the autopsies on Hulett and Linda, the doctor found Linda to have suffered at least 69 separate injuries prior to death, including injuries caused by blunt force trauma, cutting, stabbing, and suffocation. He said that Linda died from the multiple injuries that were inflicted upon her. Those included sharp force injuries predominantly to the torso. Those included blunt force injuries predominantly to the head. There were also sharp force injuries to the neck. The pathologist found Hulett to have suffered numerous injuries as well, predominantly to his face and head. The pathologist concluded that Hullett's death was the result of blows that went to the left side of the head, fractured the skull, and then damaged the brain. Hulett was found in the freezer and presented to the pathologist, with his arms severed at the shoulder joints and his head severed at the neck. Chamberlin and Gillett were jointly charged with capital murder in the deaths of Hulett and Linda. Chamberlin filed a motion to suppress the evidence recovered from the Russell landfill, as well as a motion to suppress her statements. At the suppression hearing, 3 KBI officers, Lyon, Howell, and Kelly Ralston, testified that they were interviewing Chamberlin a total of 5 times, and in those interviews, Chamberlin admitted her participation in the murders. So we begin with the first interrogation. Lyon testified that he began an interview with Chamberlin on March the 29th. Lyon, unaware of the homicide at the time of this first interrogation, initially was solely concerned with the drugs investigation, which resulted in Chamberlin's arrest. The first interview lasted about 6 minutes, because Chamberlin requested a lawyer. Then we go on to the second interview. This is when they found the bodies. Howell, along with Lyon, interrogated Chamberlin on the morning of March the 30th, 2004. This interview began at approximately 9:43 a.m., approximately 16 hours after the first interview. Lyon, for the second time, and Howell, for the first time, interviewed Chamberlin, focusing solely on the bodies found at the farm. Howell read Chamberlin her Miranda rights at the beginning of the interview, and she signed and initiated a waiver witnessed by Howell and Lyon. The interview was not recorded on video, but was memorized by Howell's notes and investigation report. According to the report, Chamberlin described Hullett's and Linda's dead bodies in the living room, and also went on to describe injuries to Hullett's neck, her assistance in cleaning the house, and loading the bodies in the freezer, the arrangement of the bodies in the freezer, and the inclusion of a black plastic trash bag in the freezer. The interview ended at approximately 10:39 a.m. There is no evidence that Chamberlin invoked her Miranda rights during this interview. Now, the third interview happened on March the 30th at 1:24 p.m. This interview was videotaped. Chamberlin was reminded of her Miranda rights, and she confirmed she understood. During this interview, Chamberlin was very emotional, crying and apologizing. Chamberlin began to relay the details of the day of the murders, but then began to ramble. Chamberlin did not provide any details of the murders during this interview. We now move on to the fourth interview, which took place about an hour later on the same afternoon. They go through Ralston's memorized report, and in this report it indicated that Chamberlin described the details of the murders from start to finish, included Gillett bashing Hulett in the head with a hammer, the dismemberment of Hulett, and finally the placement of the bodies in the freezer where they were found. Chamberlin also spoke in detail about how she helped tape Linda's hands behind her back so she would not struggle with Chamberlin, and Gillett as they began suffocating her with a plastic bag, a process which Gillett completed. The report indicates that the interview concluded with Chamberlin's last statement that she would show Howell where the trash was dumped inside the Russell landfill. Finally, on the fifth interview on March the 31st, Howell testified that she was contacted by Officer Barrett, who stated that Chamberlin desired to talk with the KBI agent. Barrett testified that Chamberlin wanted to talk to someone and she asked to speak to one of the KBI agents. They weren't there, she asked to speak to me. Barrett passed the information to a KBI agent. Howell sent for Chamberlin and asked her whether she wanted to talk to him. She answered yes. They then videotaped the 5th interview. And in this interview, this is where she gave a full detailed account again of everything that happened, and they had it videotaped. And this is important because this was used as evidence during the trial. 2 officers from the Hattiesburg Police Department, Rusty Keyes and Terrell Carson, testified that upon arrival in Hattiesburg, Chamberlin refused to make a statement and requested a lawyer. Also, 2 jailmates of Chamberlin's at the Forest County Jail, Martha Petrovsky and Marilyn Coleman, testified at the suppression hearing. Petrovsky and Coleman, both housed in the 1-bedroom detention area where Chamberlin was detained, testified that Chamberlin admitted to participating in the murders of Hulett and Linda. The inmates went on to say that Chamberlin showed no remorse for everything that happened. Chamberlin only expressed sorrow that she was caught, Petrovsky said. She said she wasn't scared of the killings. She was really upset because she said she should have disposed of the bodies better, like feeding them to the hogs. Petrovsky was jailed on a charge of setting fire to her mother's home, and said Chamberlin told her that she and Gillett were trying to steal money from a safe in Hulett's home but were unsuccessful. According to the testimony, Hulett was murdered before Linda. Defense attorneys had said the state could not prove Chamberlin robbed the couple before their deaths, therefore making her not guilty of the capital murder charge. Chamberlin did not present evidence at the suppression hearing. The trial court entered an order denying Chamberlin's motion to suppress statements. During the trial, Chamberlin did not put on any evidence. After the 3-day trial, the jury found Chamberlin guilty on 2 counts of capital murder. During sentencing, Chamberlin called 2 former jailmates as character witnesses. This was important to her because she wanted to avoid the death penalty. She also called a psychologist appointed by the court to investigate any mitigating factors in relation to her mental state. The psychologist testified as to information she obtained from interviewing Chamberlin and people who knew her, including Chamberlin's mother, Twyla Spear. Chamberlin's aunt Loma Wagner also testified, as well as a longtime friend from childhood, Veronica. The most emotional testimony came from Gillett's aunt, Marcia Gillett, and his mother, Vicky Hulett, who both shed tears during their depositions. In her 2-hour pre-recorded testimony, Vicky began crying at just the mention of her son's name. When defense attorney James Lappin quizzed her about Vernon, she said, "I think about him all the time. I loved him very much." Now, at the conclusion of the sentencing phase, in accordance with the recommendation of the jury, Lisa Jo Chamberlin was sentenced to death, and a year later, in 2007, Roger Lee Gillett was also sentenced to death. The U.S. Supreme Court declined to hear an appeal from Lisa Jo Chamberlin, who was seeking a new trial. Chamberlin sought U.S. Supreme Court review of her petition, which the justices denied without comment. Chamberlin had claimed, among other things, that her trial attorney failed to question prospective jurors about their feelings about the death penalty, failed to raise the issue of her drug addiction, and failed to raise the issue of her dominance by a co-defendant. In other words, she's saying her attorney let her down. Well, she wasn't interviewed once or twice, she was interviewed 5 times. And it seems in 3 of those interviews, she told everything that happened in full detail. So, jury bias or not, she's guilty. Is the death penalty the correct decision? Comment, tell me what you think.
My next letter is from Lisa Chamberlin. Lisa and another man had 2 roommates. They held them at gunpoint and ordered them to open a safe. When they didn't open the safe, they shot them dead. She doesn't mind about talking about her case, but it is an appeal right now because there were too many colored people apparently for her liking in her jury. I don't see how that can be very beneficial for an appeal, but she's definitely trying.